Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios, broadcasting as ever from the beautiful beaches of the last free state in America, Florida. It is the 17th of January, 2024, and I am honored and delighted to have an old friend in the studios via the magic of the interwebs coming to us from England, Richard Bermitz, who has been in the UK sports advertising industry since 1974. Richard, thank you for taking the time out to talk to us.
Great pleasure, Chris. I mean, we go back a long way. We Botswana all those years ago.
Indeed.
And I can still remember you running out of the tent, frightened to death of a wasp. But we'll keep that one quiet because we don't want to spoil that for all your admirers.
that was some wasp. I recall it being a pack of hyenas, but somewhere in between there is some truth. And then after the monkeys ate all of your drugs, that was fun. So
that's right.
Tale for another day. So a couple of things I want to chat about today. One would be the topical, distressing resurgence of Jew hatred on the continent and in the UK. But
sure.
Maybe we could kick off on a more optimistic note to drag our viewers and listeners in. I think a lot of people don't know much about the business end of sports, quite frankly. I mean, they've seen Arlo, the sports agent, on HBO, but all the rest of it, I think they know very little about. Maybe you could kind of give us the highlights.
Sure. Well, I mean, the American model and the UK model have always been quite different. You look at American stadiums, and there's nothing particularly prominent in terms of sponsors. They are there, but they don't have the kind of branding and profile in the stadia that they do over here. And I think that's basically because they spend their money, massive money, in the commercial breaks between innings or between plays, whichever sport you're in. And I always remember going to see the Chicago White Sox many years ago for what I would call rounders, but you call baseball. Yeah. And I used to think, what's going on? What's the delay? And of course, the penny dropped, and I realized the delay was to sell the broadcast airtime, which is where the revenue is driven.
Right.
In the UK, although there is, commercial television, the revenue is driven more in terms of, in these days, the massive revenues that the Premier League obtain for the sale of the broadcast, particularly in North America now. I mean, up until about 10 years ago, UK football was seen on broadcasters in the States, but not to the level it is today. And of course, as the Premier League has managed to expand its footprint on a worldwide basis, they command such greater revenues than any other European league. And that's where the wages are driven for the players, etc., etc. And it's funny, if I wind back to all the years ago when I first joined my late father in business in Hull, in East Yorkshire, I remember there were great arguments about whether or not professional sports teams would be allowed to put a brand on the shirt or the jersey, as you call it in this. And it was, it was never going to happen. And the first sport in the UK to allow it was the game of rugby. My father was always quite a visionary. And I remember one of the first teams was a team in my hometown of Hull. And they put a tyre company, a local tyre company, on the shirt, Savoy Tyres. And I remember my father speaking to the owner of the club and saying, you do realise that the players are now going to demand more money because they're carrying an advert on the chest.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And the owner said, no, we've got them under contract. They'll do as they say. The next day in the local Hull newspaper, I think the headline was something like, Hull Kingston Rovers players strike over branding on shirts, demanding more money. A week after that, they all got a pay rise. And it's very interesting that even in those a small example in those early days of a reasonably minor regional sport, it just showed the mindset of a professional sports player who would suddenly think, wait a minute.
You've got a limited lifetime because it's a physical activity, and you struck a deal with the club, and then all of a sudden you find out they're making more revenue on something, and moreover, to add insult to industry, it's on you physically.
Correct.
You better want
Correct.
a piece of that.
Yeah. And so those times were quite naive, both in football, in the top league of football, and you would see around the perimeter of a pitch the local builder, car,
Sure.
retailer, etc., etc. And those guys were advertising not because they thought it would necessarily do their business a great deal of good, but because they supported that was their local side. They wanted to see their name on the perimeter of the pitch
Right.
when they sat watching the game.
Right. They
Um,
weren't busy trying to figure out the ROI on their ad spend to figure
not
out if
at all.
their name
Not at
behind the
all.
plate was going to matter or not.
Exactly. And again, saying that my father was visionary, he was. He suddenly thought to himself, in those days, the main broadcast of top level English football was our Saturday night highlights program. Games weren't shown live, a
Hmm.
composite of maybe 10 games, getting a few minutes each to make up an hour's program.
Hmm.
My father thought to himself, if I can go to national brands and say to them, I can guarantee you will be on the main broadcaster every Saturday night.
Right. For at least
That's
3 minutes, depending upon who you're busy putting your
yeah,
pockets of work.
offer. What he realized was that if he could aggregate the rights from a number of different clubs, that would be the way to deliver that package.
Yep.
So he started approaching clubs
Hmm.
and buying up the exclusive rights for the perimeter, guaranteeing the clubs an income. He had to, with their help, persuade the clubs to speak to the local advertisers and say to them, listen, you might be spending in those days £2,000 for a season. We're very grateful for that money, but would you be prepared to spend it in a different area of the club? Free up the space.
Right. So you sell that to the national brands, and the local advertisers would get something different, like the cups or
Yes.
the billboard.
So they created things like sponsor the match ball or sponsor a player or whatever. That money went in. So it actually was an exponential sale. That revenue stayed,
Right.
and the perimeter was offered to national brands. And interesting, thinking back in those days, we would approach, for example, the typical brands that you'd look to try to get involved, like a McDonald's, a Coca-Cola, and they were interested, but they were nervous because they didn't want to be seen sitting next to, Fred Blogg's local scrap
Right.
metal.
Exactly. We buy your scrap better.
Yeah, yeah. But slowly but surely, the business developed. And the fascinating thing is, of the rights on below is put together with packages where we guarantee it's now minutes, because of course it's all digital.
Right,
Going
because
back in the
for
day,
anyone watching European sport, you'll see the perimeter ads like either flip. Well, it used to flip over, right? There was kind of a physical make. Now it's all
that's
digital,
right.
so it gets
Yeah, well,
replaced every so often.
yeah. So
And a
so
quick
now,
question on that. I always
yeah,
wondered, is there differential charging for times in the match? Like, is it better to be there on the open and also the last minute of the match? Does that cost more than just
no,
randomly being there?
no.
No, that's
I
interesting.
mean, what is interesting is that we sell a guaranteed amount of minutes on each game across a season. Okay, so a brand might buy 5 minutes on 6 grounds for the season,
Right.
and that's charged per minute as a multiple. The only differentiation in price, even with the clubs that have a higher profile, it's a consistent rate because the argument is wherever you're advertising, you're hitting the same television audience.
Sure.
Now, the big difference is, and this is an interesting argument insofar as we could sell every minute on every game to a betting and gaming brand.
Right.
at a premium rate.
Sure.
Now, in lots of European territories, betting and gaming is now dead area. They do not accept that advertising for moral reasons, because of all the harm it
Right.
potentially
All the
does
gamblers
for.
ruin their lives, so we're not about to
Yeah,
advertise the tool for their personal destruction on our sports
that's
team.
in England still. If you look, I haven't looked at it that closely these days, but a majority of the teams, their main sponsor is a betting brand. Many of them from Asia. Um, they have to have a UK betting license to advertise. However, a lot of them are Asian based because, as you probably know, that part of the world literally will bet on two flies crawling up a wall.
It's fascinating.
Yeah,
And I don't know which is worse, being a chronic gambler or a chronic alcoholic. I've seen both
yeah.
types destroy their lives.
So we as a business actually self-regulated ourselves and said we will only have 3 betting brands.
Hmm.
And it was the only sector really that was almost a tendering process. So you could actually tender those minutes because they would be fighting for actually a share of voice.
I'm
So the
sure.
betting brands, the
Especially
betting
if there's a
brands,
quota system in place and they know that they're competing against each other, not just against McDonald's and everyone else whom they're willing to overpay against. That's a smart
yeah,
system.
yeah. So we'd take premium rates for the betting brands, and we were trying to take a relatively moral stance, if you want to call it. And yet, what would then happen is the clubs would want, in addition to the revenue we brought in, part of which was for betting and gaming, they would decide to have an official betting partner. Then they would decide they wouldn't have an official betting partner for the UK. They'd have one for the UK. They'd have another one for Asia. They'd try and break it up. And so that despite what we were doing, because we didn't have every minute on every game, out of a 90-minute game, on some clubs we might have half of those minutes. On other clubs we might have a third of the minutes.
So the clubs
The
themselves were managing a portfolio of advertisers. One, they'd come to you for a bulk deal,
Yeah.
and they would manage the rest of it themselves.
So they would use the rest for their own partners and sponsors.
Right.
And it became difficult at times in that particular sector. And then you would have other key areas from time to time. Tire companies would be fighting with each other, and you try to make sure that by using different clubs, you'd allocate them in different areas to give them a little bit of exclusivity. But as I say, the concept of aggregation, which my dad saw all those years ago, is exactly what's happening today. The difference is now it's become even more sophisticated, if you like, so that in the Premier League in the UK, the brands are mainly looking for the international reach of the Premier League. And for the rates that are charged, unless you've got that footprint, you've got huge wastage.
Right.
And so we then say to UK brands, look at the league below, which has a very strong UK footprint, and actually what's called Championship is still the 5th biggest broadcast reach in Europe. It's bigger than a lot of the top leagues in the other main countries. So that's quite interesting. And then you've got the individual cup competitions. So it's sold and resold and fragmented, which is interesting.
I love every market that has any ability to aggregate and analyze data is just the best thing in the universe. So I assume that a lot of what you do is data analytic driven, or is it the ad agencies who are saying, this here's we broadcast? Is it ad agencies helping big brands, or do the brands have their own internal teams? Like, how has that changed over time in terms of who's driving the analytics so the executive knows this is where I'm spending my 3 million euros this year?
So there's been a growth of companies that do independent monitoring, so they can actually break down the demographics of the audience and provide that to the brands. And those advertising agencies that do get involved need that information to justify it to the
Sure.
brands that they're representing. It's interesting that the actual sports advertising industry sometimes is classified by the agencies as outdoor. So in the same area that they would buy billboards.
Right.
We always say to them, it's not outdoor, it's broadcast.
Yeah.
However, we're not so stupid as to say, I'm ever so sorry, because you allocated in one area, we're not going to take your dollar. We don't mind. You know, if that's the place that they put it,
Sure.
then that's fine. And one of the biggest accounts that I dealt with over many years, which is ultimately an American brand now, is Stanley Tools Black & Decker, which back in the day, again, going back into history, was a tool business in Sheffield, which was the original Stanley Tools.
And Black & Decker is
the
American brand.
Yeah.
Right.
But the business is driven from the States.
Yeah.
And McCann Erickson own the brand, represent the brand on an international basis. And it's quite interesting. It's handled out of Manchester and London, Universal McCann now. But within their organization, they have Rapport, which is their outdoor agency. And that's where they actually place the business from. And it was interesting. I had conversations with the guys there who I got on extremely well with. And they were fiercely protective of that piece of business, because for the outdoor section of that agency, it represented quite a big chunk of money. Whereas if it disappeared into the broadcast side, it was relatively insignificant. So they were fiercely protective.
Well, that's interesting. So if I'm a brand, I want to be paying close attention, not just where the advertising is getting done, but how much my business means to the agency itself, because I'm going to get better attention in an area where I am a big cheese, as opposed to, if I'm fighting against Mercedes-Benz, who's going to throw millions per week at advertising everywhere, I'm going to get lost in the shuffle and ignored.
Yeah. So Stanley Tools Black & Decker, they've now been with the business for a considerable amount of time. They've been one of the more creative brands in the way they've used the LED. They had a Black & Decker lawnmower cutting the pitch at one point, so they were quite creative. So it would run along the perimeter of the pitch and cut the grass on the LED.
Yeah,
they'd have a drill removing a screw, and the panel would fall down. But it's interesting that we've always said to brands, don't forget, you can be as creative as you like, but you're viewing the brand from across a pitch on a camera,
right,
which is moving relatively quickly. So don't forget at all times to have the brand name prominent, because for all the creativity you may have, if you can't see the brand name, you ain't doing the job.
Well, as someone who's got nothing to do with advertising, I certainly, can recall instances of, even on TV, where really great ad, like there's this thing that went on forever here in the States, for Aflac, which is what they do is they insure people for, like work-related disability, right? So you might have health insurance. So if you fall off a ladder in a factory, well, they're going to take care of your medical bills, but you're now unemployed, right? And so the Aflac steps in and they pay your living expenses for whatever period. That's what the insurance is. But for years, they had all these funny ads where they've got this goose who squawks out Aflac, right? And that's the joke. But like, I must have seen that for a decade before I had a clue what it was, right? And so there's a great example of kind of ineffective advertising. Like, it was recognizable beyond belief. But if you'd ask anyone, what does Aflac do? You draw a blank stare. So
Yeah,
and it gets more specified as you're talking about. You got something free, you got something on a pitch, and people looking at it, and then it flashes by on a camera screen. That's a lot to think about.
yeah. And so, the business developed from just selling pure advertising to brokering deals for partnerships with clubs. One of the big questions about a brand is sometimes brands would come to us or we'd speak to them and they would say, I want to be a sponsor at Manchester United,
Right,
Liverpool, one of
right.
the top teams.
Something huge.
Yeah, and the entry point would be a seven-figure sum and multiples of seven figures.
Yeah.
And we'd say to them, before you commit that money to one club, how are you going to exploit that sponsorship? Because if you're not going to put as much in again to actually use the IP rights,
Right.
players, run competitions, really squeeze the lemon, you could spend a fraction of that money and have minutes on more or less, the whole league, so that your brand will be seen more than it will be on one club. Of course, for a well-run sponsorship, there's a very strong reason to be a club partner or a club sponsor. But there are many, many examples of chief executives' wives who are supporters of a particular club and they get seduced into piling in a load of cash. I think there's a great example with Chrysler, who spent a fortune at Manchester United. The guy signed it off, and I don't know whether it's apocryphal, but the story was he got the sack the next week because he signed it off really without discussion, and people said, well, why? And he loved that particular football club.
Often not a good reason in an American boardroom where people are looking to cut each other's throats all the time.
Yeah. So I mean, at the moment they have TeamViewer. Now that was interesting because we all have TeamViewer on our computers. When it suddenly appeared as the sponsor, we all went, TeamViewer. Oh yeah. That's a great example of utilizing an internationally known sports club to suddenly raise the awareness of what actually everybody had as a tool on their computers.
And what is that? I mean, that must be an industry specialized thing?
So TeamViewer is if you if you've got a remote IT company, you want to share your computer screen, you want them to let them on to sort out some IT problems. TeamViewer is like the international recognized tool. But who knew?
Huh. That's interesting.
What
are the biggest change? I mean, this is one of those areas where there's a huge amount of detail. What would you say from 74 till now? Like, what was the biggest sweeping change that entered the world of sport business?
Well, I think the biggest. I talk about football a lot because football is kind of sets the model that a lot of the other sports have followed. The biggest change is that when the Premier League was formed, 1991, it centralized the clubs took internally the rights. So it was quite a tricky period of time for us in this business. What happened was the broadcasters, of which there were two. There was the BBC, which is the national broadcaster for which we all pay a relatively small license fee.
Right.
And then there was ITV, which was the commercial broadcaster, which gets their revenue from advertising, commercial advertising. And they had a very comfortable agreement between themselves that they would bid each round for the Saturday night program. And although they wouldn't admit it, they were able to hold down the rights. So they were paying about £1.5 million per season.
Right. Good old-fashioned collusion.
Yeah. The top clubs realized and were told that those rights, these were the domestic rights, were worth substantially more than that.
Sure.
And it was just at the point of time that the satellite broadcasters were coming on board. And of course, to drive audience, the one thing a broadcaster wants is sports rights.
Right, of course. That's the big draw. You don't have to debate that. Right.
Yeah. So a guy who worked for ITV left and became head of sport at Sky Television. And good guy, we'd known him for many years, and he told the top clubs that actually if the rights became available, the next tendering process, he would be able to get something like a multiple of 50.
Wow.
For what was being paid.
Right.
Okay. So they were aware of this. They were aware of this, and top clubs decided they needed to form a breakaway league. Now, how were they going to persuade the other 14 clubs to come along with them? The way they did it was they said to them, if you join us in a new league, we will centralize all the commercial revenue, the broadcasting rights, the advertising rights that we sold, and we'll share them equally.
Right. So we'll have a cartel that faces the broadcasters, and we're a much stronger position to fight for the whole.
Exactly.
That's great.
And long story short, the clubs involved were Manchester United, Liverpool, Everton, Tottenham, Arsenal, and they needed a sixth club. They got Queen's Park Rangers, which were a relatively small club, to come on board. That gave them enough power to actually persuade the other 14 to come along. And I always remember, without mentioning the particular club, we were in a chairman's office. We used to have a rolling contract with one of the top six. Very easy relationship with them. And we went to renew our contract, and the owner said, I'm ever so sorry, we can't renew your contract for next year. And he told us confidentially what was going on and how they were going to persuade the other clubs to come along, which was a blow. We understood the rationale, and we managed to negotiate a deal so that we would look after all the actual logistics. We'd do all the production costs. We'd produce all the signage. There were other rights that they would still allow us to continue to have. But he said something very interesting. He said, so we're going to share equally. Equally meant half of it would be shared equally, and the other half would be distributed depending on the number of appearances on television, on live games, and how high up you ended up in the league. So it was a fair distribution.
Yeah, so there's some incentive to reward the teams that are really the big draw to begin with.
So that he also said to us, however, it won't last forever.
Right.
Stick around, guys, and the rights will probably,
revert back after a while. Someone will see that you get a better deal, right?
That was a massive change, Chris, because
how long did that go on for, that sort of cabal?
So I think from 91, it probably lasted centrally for about 4 or 5 years. Until such time as the clubs agreed that they could once again start to individually sell their rights. But the exponential increase in the broadcast revenue in the UK was massive.
Sure.
And to give an example, I think the year before the Premier League was formed, one of the top clubs will be generating something like £500,000 for the advertising rights. And that's sitting on their P&L account against a share of £1.5 million worth of broadcasting rights was a big number. Go forward a year, all of a sudden, the share of, I can't remember the exact figure, but the share of, say, 30, 40, 50 million pounds compared to the advertising rights, suddenly the balance shifted massively.
That's huge.
And each round that's taken place, those rights have become absolutely huge, both domestically and developing the international rights. So now You have Sky Television that have the majority, but you also have what is now called TNT Sports, which is part of Discovery. You have Amazon, who've bought a number of games. There's
Well, that was my question. That was my question to jump to today. How much does the shifting landscape of content distribution change that model? Right, people watching on the streaming on their phones or wherever. Does that massively change it, or is it just the same sort of economics, just a new bunch of platforms paying the bills?
Well, it's changed insofar as it's the revenue that it's driven is massive.
Because now you can actually do pay-per-view with modern technical infrastructure. Right? Before it was very hard to do. Now it's like, yeah, I'll pay 30 cents to watch that clip reel, or I'll pay $4 to watch the game, and you aggregate that together. That's got to be a big source of funding for these folks.
Absolutely, and of course, what's interesting now is that if you go to Spain, if you go to Italy, you go to Germany, the clubs are allowed to individually sell the broadcasting rights.
Right.
And that's why the leagues in those countries are so, if you want to say, one or two-sided, because the massive clubs like a Barcelona and a Real Madrid selling their broadcasting rights compared to the rest of the league is so much bigger. It gives them a greater spending potential. Whereas in the UK, they have a model where each club is a shareholder. The 20 clubs are all equal shareholders in the Premier League. Nothing can change unless they get a vote of 14 to change anything. And therefore, the central selling of the broadcast remains pretty solid. Whereas it's a different six now, but within the six, there's still, the Manchester Uniteds, the Liverpools, the Arsenals. They would love to be able to sell the broadcasting rights individually, because again, it would make it very lopsided. The other big change that I haven't mentioned is virtual advertising.
Of course.
So that what you can see in the stadium, as opposed to what is broken down into different territories through technology cameras, is quite different. So again, it's not been applied in the UK yet. The reason is the money generated from broadcast is so massive that there hasn't quite been the need. But when you go into Italy, into Germany, you can actually buy a virtual feed to go into certain territories, or you can buy the whole world, if you like. So again, that has made new opportunities to break down that inventory. What I always found fascinating is there's always been this wish to use the perimeter in a virtual match. In Holland,
and now you can
they have virtual banners. So if you watch a game in Holland, you'll see these. You've seen the huge banners, the real huge banners coming in, down the crowds. In Holland, they do it virtually. So it's a virtual banner or an outdoor site, which is created, by the camera.
That's brilliant.
Which, if it was there in the ground, it would obliterate spectators' view.
Right, exactly. I was going to say you could actually put up big fluttering signage, but if you did it in the physical world, the people in the stand would lose their minds.
That's right. So they'll have a bottle of beer breaking through the center circle, coming up through the center circle. This time, and I've always thought that they're much more creative and they're using the technology rather than necessarily worrying about just reproducing what is on the perimeter.
Absolutely, and that's such a smart thing. I remember again, this isn't my space at all, but I was working on something in high speed identification and photography. And what was great, these guys that came up with this tool, it was years ago, so they must have used some version of it. It was initially developed for the military and for kind of crowd control, right? So high speed, high definition cameras, and they built this tool for, I think it was like the San Francisco 49ers or something. I think it was a West Coast team. Anyway, the point was, say there are 50,000 seats in an arena, And especially if you are someone that's got a season pass, right? They're experimenting with all this, fan engagement tech. So
Mm.
you've got a special seat, and they know you're there. And if they know that you like near the half to have a beer and a hot dog, like you can have it all pre-ordered, and they'll just bring it right to you. So convenient stuff.
Mm.
And then these guys tied this tech to to take a picture of everyone, like during a goal or during something
Yeah.
great event, and they take 300,000 pictures, three of everybody, at rapid high def speed. And so then it was offered to you as a memento, like you get a printout, much like at Disney, right? Of yay, you're streaming. What they didn't count on is people just found it like crazy creepy, right?
Okay.
Like I'm at the game with my kids, and you're
Yeah.
taking high def pictures of me.
Yeah.
So it backfired when they tried it. People were like,
It's
"What the what? I didn't consent to this. What are you doing?"
sure.
It was
Sure.
it was an interesting line to walk between a marketing team who's only thinking in terms of fan engagement. Like you came to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
park, you came for a fun day, but you also there are plenty of people who are like, are you nuts? I've got a restraining order against a stalker in Seattle. You can't blast my picture on, up without my knowledge. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
that's interesting. I mean, there's a ton there. I did want to switch gears though. Is there one massive thing you would say, um, kind of about that evolution you've seen of sport being kind of a club-based community engagement fan base sort of thing? Has that eroded, do you think, because of the advent of
I
broadcasting,
think,
the internet? Like I could be an Arsenal fan from Florida, right? I don't have to be there. Is any
yeah.
of
I
that
mean,
changed?
Manchester United are often accused of, spot the fan that lives in Manchester. Because every game there are flight loads of people coming from all over the world,
Right.
and I think it's also quite worrying that the cost to attend a game as a family
Yeah, it's
is
absurd.
extremely expensive. And
Yeah.
so when you look around a ground at the demographic, I think it's relatively old
Yeah.
because to take a family, um, you're talking four five per game, $400-500 per match, if not
Yeah.
more. And
Not
then
more. Sure.
the London clubs are even more expensive.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think I've always thought it's quite sad that as the revenues increase and the income increases massively, for me, what's more important is to have a full stadium and to sell merchandise and get people into the ground and not necessarily, squeeze that revenue stream to such an extent that you exclude people who just can't afford to go. And
Yeah.
they just, that's just a personal view. But I think that's a big change. I think what's also quite sad, and I don't know whether you find this in the States, is that there's now an environment in most English grounds that crowds are segregated very much between the home fan and the away fan. Now, in football particularly, so that
Often for safety reasons.
yeah, but I think that when I was a kid, everybody be mixed with everybody else,
Right.
and if the opposition score, and you look at a fan who's supporting that side, and he's obviously happy and excited, you're disappointed. But
Right.
today, even in executive areas, and you might take a client along who supports the other side, and they score, and he'll jump up spontaneously. He's
Right.
likely to get thrown out the ground,
Right. Well, that's crazy. I do
and
know
it's sad.
that is said. I also, in terms of the fan base, I grew up playing Little League baseball, high school baseball, was a baseball fan, like, loved going to see the Yankees, more often see the Mets in New York, right?
Mm.
Um, uh, and so I was a baseball fan, like watched the sport, enjoyed it. And I got out of college, and the year I got out of college was the year that these spoiled brats struck. They went on strike, not to demand that there be at least a third of the stadium that would be affordable to working class people. No,
Mm.
these spoiled brat millionaires in the house that Babe Ruth built while he had a
Mm.
side job in the wintertime, right? they wanted more because they needed another Ferrari. And it angered me so badly that I stopped watching baseball. I never and there's a guy, Derek Jeter, who was a New York Yankees apparently star player. I literally had never heard of him until I read a Forbes article about him after he retired. Like they angered me so much because at the time I'm working on Wall Street, right? Single guy working on Wall Street, can afford to do whatever I want.
Yeah.
I found the prices offensive. And I began to think back to the times that I would, it was a common thing of dads mainly back then in the 70s, 80s, who would take, 4 or 5 kids to a baseball game for your birthday.
Yeah.
And some people that hurt a little more, but like everyone could do it. And they made it so high-end white-collar professionals would only be like, well, maybe we can bring a couple of kids, right? And that really angered me. It really did. And that echoes what you're saying there. Like, you're making plenty of money. And the fact is, now you're making more money for broadcasting. You should at least say that 20% in the top tier are still $3 a ticket. The brilliant thing the San Francisco baseball team, Pirates, did, and I knew the data statistician who ran their sales, he prided himself on the fact that for 3 seasons in a row, and that was when I knew him, they'd never had an empty seat at the stadium, which meant that they had their club members, they had, the high-end tickets. But he's like, if you were patient enough, and if we haven't sold those tickets, 2 hours before the game starts, we would send interns out into the streets to give them away.
Okay.
He's like, that's just what we did. We wanted the full stadium for the optics, but also for the team. And I thought that was kind of fun.
Yeah,
but it got me very angry that you couldn't be a working class family and take kids to a ball game. That offended me.
I think the other big change, I was thinking about it whilst you were just talking, that when we started in the business, clubs were owned by the local businessman made good.
Right.
Who loved his team, who did it for the love of the team, not for any financial gain.
Pinnacle of a dream. He's made it. He can own the team.
Yeah, and that individual was often criticized because he was criticized on the basis that you've just made it your own fiefdom, it's your own plaything, you don't really care. Now, if you asked a lot of ordinary supporters today whether they would prefer that to the kind of ownership that we now see, where it is so far beyond that. So again, the leveraged buyout of Manchester United by the Glazer family, which was a perfectly legitimate leveraged buyout. They used the asset to borrow the money to buy the club. They didn't put any of their own cash in.
Oof.
And they've taken tremendous dividends year on year. And the fans hate them. They absolutely detest them. There are protests year in, year out. They rarely attend any games. They haven't spent money on the infrastructure of the stadium. The roof is leaking. When it rains, the supporters get wet. It's they've just, for them, it's a, listen,
business.
As a business proposition, it was brilliant.
Right.
But the distance between the owner and the fan couldn't be greater.
That's
now, just recently, Jim Ratcliffe, who owns Ineos, the power-based company, he's just bought a 25%. They said they were carrying out a review and they wanted to potentially sell the business, and they use various brokers to forget the group who's marketing. Anyway, they seem to have a target of 6 or 7 billion. They paid £800 million for it.
Right.
So that's a reasonable return.
That's a good return,
considering they've had it a number of years and they've had substantial dividends every year.
Sure.
Anyway, there was a talk of the Qatari, the Qataris buying it. they made a play for the business. For whatever reason, that didn't happen. And Jim Ratcliffe has bought 25% stake for 1.25
Right.
billion.
Well, the Qataris are too busy funding Hamas, right? So they're really busy right now. So they don't have any free cash flow. Once they kill all the Jews, which is a nice segue. So
Yeah.
the one other thing I want to chat about is there's been from our perspective in the States, I've been writing about, yelling about, talking about, and being ignored about the creeping Marxism and concomitant hatred for the Jews that comes
You've
along
been very
with it
busy, Chris.
for
You've
years.
been
I've
very busy.
been busy about it, but I was busy about
Yeah.
it for years, and a lot of people kind of looked at me like I was nuts. And after
Yeah.
October 7th, horribly, I mean, Israel's its own horror, but the resounding result in America and the UK and Europe and Australia of on October 8th, people rallying around and screaming "Free Palestine." What has been going on in the UK?
No, well, we're getting a lot of the same. I'm actually going on a march on Sunday in Manchester, a solidarity march, and I think we've got Ion Levy, who's been very prominent. He's in, he's a spokesman from the Israeli government. He's really a tremendous example of, despite how many times interviewers try to wind him up, he's extremely calm and rational and a little bit like Mark Regev. They're great because they just don't rise to it.
Right.
So he's in the UK
Better
doing
than me.
Yeah. So he's on a tour in the UK, appearing on most of the main broadcasters. He's doing extremely well, but despite that, you watch the kind of output, and it is, as you say, it's just so bizarre. It's like the South African bringing, the
country that they have rolling blackouts for a third of the year.
Yep.
They can't even keep the effing power on, and they think it's important to rush to the ICJ, wildly misnamed, by the way, to bitch and moan about something that has nothing to do with them.
Yeah. So we've got problems on various university campuses. It's been going on for many years. There are various organizations over here who are very, very prominent and have had a lot of success in getting some of these deans and academics taken down because of their, what they've spoken about on campus and how they've made Jewish students very, very uncomfortable. And it's been like this creeping undercurrents.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's been there for a long time. So we've got the campaign against anti-Semitism here. We had a big battle within the Labour Party with Jeremy Corbyn.
Oh, what a nightmare.
What a surprise. He's suddenly appeared as one of the big advocates for South Africa.
What a nightmare. When he was photographed laying the wreath at the memorial to the PLO murderers, incredible that the UK populace is polite enough. He tried that shit here. I don't think he'd make it to his car.
No. Well, I mean, so you've got this kind of movement of people who, many of them are just totally ignorant. I find it hard to even say they're anti-Semitic. They're just stupid. They get carried along with a wave of things like, it's almost like when you were a student, you had to be a communist because at that part of your life, that seemed to be the right thing to do until you grew up and realized the reality of politics. So, it was the right thing to be. So some of these kids, it's not about forgiving them. I just think to myself, you just don't understand, but it's so dangerous. Whereas
gotta be dangerous, and you're more forgiving. Yeah. I'm over the more education is needed because I hate to say it, but as Jews, we automatically revert to believing if you were only smarter about something, you'd see the right way. Lots of these folks, they are plenty educated, and they have formed an opinion. There are a lot of PhDs in the Nazi Party, And a lot of
Sure.
these idiots, the Muslim Brotherhood founder, came to America and got his PhD. While he was here, he looked around, and whether it's because none of them would date him or not, he got really angry at all the pretty girls in short skirts and went back to Egypt and started thundering about the evils of the West. So I
Yeah.
wish it were education, but lots of these assholes are perfectly well educated. They're just
Yeah.
hate filled.
I mean, we have in this country, we've got a guy who's a writer, comedian, actor, David Baddiel, who wrote a book called Jews Don't Count.
I haven't seen that.
And
Good
now
God.
he's fascinating because he's Jewish. Um, he describes himself as a Jewish agnostic, so he's not a practicing Jew.
Right.
However, he's actually come out and said suddenly when he's asked to make a statement, whereas in the past the conflation of Zionism and anti-Semitism, he said, I'm not interested in Israeli politics. That's got nothing to do with me.
Got nothing to do with
He's,
me. Au contraire.
the penny has suddenly dropped, and he's actually come out publicly and said, "Excuse me, I'm wrong, and I've seen that I'm wrong."
Right.
And intellectually, he's made a big play of this. We have Stephen Fry, who's a very well-known actor,
Yeah.
raconteur.
Yeah.
He's an openly gay man. He's Jewish. Nobody necessarily knew. He never made a big thing of being Jewish, but he did it. We have on Christmas Day, we've always had a message from the monarch. 3 o'clock on a Christmas Day, the Queen, and now, of course, King Charles, does a broadcast to the nation. Right. Stephen Fry does an alternative broadcast to the nation. He's always done it on a different channel. And his broadcast was basically about respecting each other's religions. He made a big play of the fact that growing up as a gay man was a challenge. He never made a big fact of the fact he was Jewish, but the two things in the current climate can make it very uncomfortable.
Right.
And he got both vilified by Jew haters on the one hand, right, and applauded by everybody else. Personally, one of the most gratifying things I've had is that my ex-sales director, who's a guy from Liverpool, who I worked with for a number of years, never really discussed politics with him at all. He is so pro-Israel, pro-Jewish. He said to me, he found himself in Liverpool. This was not long after October the 7th, with people with Palestinian flags. Wow. And he said that his wife had to with kind of hold him back because he was about to pile in and start, ripping these flags down. And he said, I wanted to go into Trafalgar Square in London and stand with an Israeli flag, just peacefully saying nothing. Right. And he said, believe me, there is a silent majority that are with you. I said, Ian, it's gratifying, but we need some of that silent majority not to be so silent, because
no more silence.
We in terms of numbers, we're not a percentage. We're nowhere near we're nothing. And so we have rallies, we have a completely different type of march. I mean, we watched the one in Washington. It was in Washington, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
In DC. I mean, that was fantastic.
Yeah. That
was amazing to watch. How it resonated in the States, I'm not quite sure how things are over there. But here, I don't think we're not suffering as badly as in some of the European countries. But we have the CST, the Community Security Trust, which is a charity, supported charity. The government, the UK government, gives quite a few £1 million every year to support it as well. And so now, when you're walking around here, where we're in quite a heavily populated Jewish area in North Manchester, and the guys are out day and night patrolling around the kids' schools, shops, in high-vis jackets. Yeah. Of course, I mean, we've spoken about this before privately, about the fact that here, we have no weapons, we have no arms. We just, we may have a whistle and a radio to speak to the police, but the police and the CST have a very close working relationship.
That's good.
And that's the way it is here, and it's incredibly sad because we also know that there are Muslims and Jews living in Manchester getting on extremely well, and
Of course.
it's this it's just this fringe of, as I say, just reverting back to what I said before, it's how young some of these protesters are. They just don't understand at all, and how they can not see what happened on October the 7th for what it is, and how Hamas have openly said, we want to
Yeah.
do it again and again and
Yeah.
again.
At the same
And just,
time as denying it happened. What I
yeah,
love about the mental derangement of your basic Jew hater, whether dumb or brilliant, is their ability to hold two completely absurd ideas. I actually was watching this idiot, this imam in Sydney. First claim, that's all nonsense. There was a military attack on October 7th, and the IDF killed all those Jews to make it look like the Liberation Front of Hamas did it. And then later in the same screaming sermon, he said, "It will do it to you again." Which one is it? Did you do it or did you not do it?
yeah,
Which one, buddy? And they are just filled with
we
evil
had,
hatred. And part of what we've tried to, I've been asked to speak at my daughter's university. Part of what we tried to convey is like, you've got two stark different visions of the world. One is there's a fixed pie, and if there's a fixed pie, that must mean the Jews took it. Right? So if there's a rich Jew, there must be a poor Muslim, right? In very simplistic terms. Versus the real world, which is if you create something, the pie grows for everybody. Right. So dealing with the kids in the States, some of them are irremediable, some of them are just dumb, right? A lot of them are dumb, including surprise on Harvard Yard as they're marching and chanting from the river to the sea, blah, 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 right?
yeah,
And my favorite is someone will walk up to one of these idiots and say, "What river?" And they look at him blankly, like, "What you're chanting it? What river? Okay, easier. What sea?" 99% of them have no idea what they're even saying. And
no,
I don't know if that's good or bad, right? Maybe it would be bad if they were thoroughly conversant with the history of the region. And since the
yeah,
Jordan, you idiot, it's the Mediterranean, and we want them all gone. Maybe that's scarier than I'm an idiot going along to the protest because this cute girl I want to talk to told me to come.
yeah. And there's a lot of that.
Right,
There is
there's
a
a
lot
lot
of
of that. And if that's
yeah,
the majority, then as you say, it's a passing fad. But the danger is, as I challenge a lot of these folks, is it only matters when, Bashir Assad killed 400,000 Arab, Syrian Muslims in the past 6 years. You didn't give a shit about that, right? ISIS killed how many hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions. You weren't marching then. Why are you marching now? Because
well,
Hamas
this is,
raped and murdered Jews and we're retaliating? Like, it is a real serious problem. The only benefit I see, at least here in the States, is it has now highlighted it. So the crazy guys like me that you'd roll your eye at and like edge away from at the party, not sounding so crazy anymore when he warns about Jew hatred on American campuses.
yeah, I
Right?
mean,
I wish I were crazy. I really wish I were.
there's a lot of fear here, in terms of, as seems to be what's going to happen, that Donald Trump gets back in, his attitude to Israel.
Is phenomenal. He'd be far better. Oh my God, Obama and Biden barely tolerated Israel. Donald Trump comes back in, he'd authorize the Sixth Fleet to glass Gaza. He'd be like, "I'm
You
done with
reckon?
this crap."
It's interesting because a lot of the view from this side of the pond is a fear that wouldn't be the case. But it's interesting to hear you say that.
But what I find fascinating is anyone listens to that. The man
Mm.
created the Abraham Accords. He moved the American
Yeah,
embassy to
yeah, yeah,
Jerusalem. This
yeah.
this and this is part of what I've yelled at American media and the Democrats, which are the same thing for
Mm.
years, is you are lying to people and creating danger. This fantasy that Donald Trump is an anti-Semite, what are you talking about? Every single Jew
I
I know
don't.
who's worked with him in New York laughs at
Yeah,
that idea. His daughter's an Orthodox Jew, for Christ's sakes. This fantasy they keep pounding into people is bizarre. It is one of the biggest,
Interesting.
dumbest lies I've ever heard,
Yeah,
actually.
I think from here it's more of, obviously what you hear is America first, and that's the main kind of
Sure.
campaign. But no, I mean that's gratifying to hear that. I was going to say the politics over here. That what was extremely worrying and damaging was that when there was the rockets that apparently demolished the hospital,
Right.
which was still standing when they were showing pictures, and
Right.
all there was a bit of a small crater in the car park.
Yeah.
The BBC immediately um, put out that the IDF had bombed the
Yeah.
hospital. Now,
Crazy. And that lie
this,
still perpetuates now. Yeah.
despite I don't know 48 hours, 72 hours, they retracted that. The
Yeah.
damage was done.
Yeah.
The
Yeah. All
damage was
because
done.
Hamas builds homemade rockets by untrained people with no quality control, and at least, I don't know, 10, 20% of them just land in Gaza, wherever they fire them from. And that's been true for years. Yeah,
But
I
we have friends, a very dear friend who goes and has been doing for some time, goes into schools um, to educate kids about the Holocaust, about
yeah.
the modern day Jew, and it's very very beneficial. There's a film just came out about Nicholas Winton called One Life.
Mhm.
This was the Czechoslovakian guy who actually did have some Jewish heritage, but he was responsible for bringing over about 700 Czechoslovakian children.
Yeah.
He lived to 106. This
It's
guy, very
fabulous.
very 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 humble man, and so on a television program about 25, 30 years ago called That's Life, which is a very kind of light program on a Saturday or Sunday night about all kinds of really kind of silly topics.
Yeah.
Um, they they jumped on a story that years later he decided he had a diary, a book of the kids that he'd brought over, and there were pictures of them and the families that looked after them.
Right.
And it was actually, first of all, it was publicized in the Daily Mirror, one of the um, newspapers here, by Robert Maxwell, who had a checkered career anyway.
Yeah.
But they publicized it first. The BBC jumped onto it, and they had a program where he was sitting in the audience. I had no idea that the whole audience was made up of
Wow.
survivors. And so when the presenter, who was also Jewish, said, "Is there anybody in the audience that was one of the children?" So a lady turned around and was sitting next to him and kissed him and hugged him. And anybody else, the whole audience stood up. I mean,
That's phenomenal.
it was amazing. So this is a kind of film that we feel hopefully will go into schools. It's being released in the States. It's called One Life.
Awesome.
You should try to see it.
Yeah,
So
well,
there's a lot of education that does go into schools, and you hope that that will make the difference. But yeah, some of the things happening openly in the streets. I mean, what I can't understand is if we decided to have a Shabbos morning service, in Westminster.
yeah.
I'm not saying we would be stopped, but it would not be necessarily approved of.
Yeah.
Worship in your synagogues, fine, but
Yeah.
in the street, no.
Sure.
You
Well,
know,
I mean, this is a discussion we've had repeatedly, and I have with many of my, British friends, right? Is the
yeah,
very different view Americans have about privately owned firearms versus
yeah,
not. But you'll notice all of the places where these lunatics are marching in America, they're all in cities that have radically restricted legal ownership of firearms. They do this
okay,
in New York City. They do it in Washington, D.C. They do it in Chicago. They don't do it in Florida, in Texas, in Georgia, in like 44 other states where if you are walking up to someone and screaming, I want you to die, and accosting them, and you get a bullet here, the police are going to carry that body away and nothing's going to happen to you except maybe an award from the mayor. You'll notice they respond to incentives. They don't come do it here. They're not dumb enough to do it here. They do it in places where the people that they're facing off against have voluntarily disarmed. And I
Right.
wish the world weren't that way,
Mm.
but it is that way.
Yeah.
And at
Yeah.
least the scum are constrained. We had the same thing with these awful racist thugs that Black Lives Matter. It's complete crap and scam from 2020. They only went and rioted in places where they knew they weren't going to face any resistance.
Yeah. Well,
They do it here.
there was a big controversy. Wembley Stadium had, over the last number of years, when it was rebuilt, they have an arch. You know, it's called the Wembley Arch, part of the architecture. When Ukraine was invaded by Russia, as one of the public shows of solidarity, they illuminated the arch in the Ukrainian flag colors,
Right.
as did many other buildings. When, after the attack on October the 7th, there was a request and a question: why are you going to light up the arch with the Israeli flag? The Football Association said that they didn't want to be seen as making any kind of political statements.
Oh, now suddenly they're apolitical.
So what's the difference between Russia invading Ukraine or the massacre?
Because everyone hates Jews.
So all that's happened now is they've decided that they will not light the arch again for any kind of political conflict. They just won't do it. Which is a
lie, because they will. When something else comes up someday that they feel will move public opinion one way, they will.
You know, the Brandenburg Gate was lit with the Eiffel Tower was lit.
Yep.
Most European landmarks showed support for Israel.
Yep.
And it was incredibly sad that the National Stadium felt that they couldn't do that.
It's 8 decades after the war ended, and we're dealing with this now.
Yeah,
it is perpetual. And as you know, because you sadly are on my distribution list, I have made it a personal mission. I will die of carpal tunnel syndrome from typing. I refuse to remain silent. Every single Jew hater that pops his or her head up in this country, I call them out. I write about it. I refuse. I refuse. And it came out of Bill Ackman wrote it after I did, saying he wanted the names of all the kids at Harvard that had signed that letter. So, which you may find encouraging or not, I already reached out to a lot of folks about this idea, and we're working on the private sector. I never want the government maintaining lists, right? That never works really well. But just like right now, we rely on credit reports and background checks, right? When you hire people in the private sector, we're building a similar thing. We're capturing all the film from all the marches, and there is, massive data science. There's facial recognition. We are going to name every single person at those marches. I don't care if it takes 5 years to do it. And when you go to look for a job, and that employer accesses that database, the employer can do what they want. But there's going to be the fact. There you were, holding a river to the sea sign, marching down Alameda in Los Angeles, right? On this date. Is that you? It looks like you. Prove to me it's not you. Because otherwise, get out.
Yeah, I mean, and
we are committed to that.
Taking it away from this particular subject, I know now that when kids apply for jobs, if they've got something historically on social media which is inappropriate, it's a black mark against them.
Yeah,
maybe very unfair in some cases, because it might have been years later.
Right?
But makes you think.
It speaks to judgment. First off, if you were dumb enough to film yourself, say, snorting cocaine, which is a federal crime, no matter what states think about marijuana, at the very least, as some of the folks we know who do that work in HR, it's an intelligence test. You control your Facebook page. Delete it. You're looking for a job, you idiot.
Yeah.
It's first off an intelligence test before anything else.
With all the how is it in the States with the different varieties of Jew, from the most liberal to the most, has this brought, in this context, are people standing together, or?
It's a lot of it comes down to Not as much as I would think. I think people are in denial. I mean, I think may particularly have a very different view of these events.
Mm.
It's it's a nightmare all the way around. But the way I look at it, and having been lived all over the world and having been cursed with reading Churchill 3 times through the Second World War, we're in World War III right now. I don't know what else anyone doesn't see. Like, we are
Yeah,
day 2, and this is going to take 5 years. And my prediction is, when it's over, there will be no more Hezbollah. There will be no more Hamas. There will be no more Islamic Jihad. The Tehrani mullahs will be dead in their graves or hanged by a rope. All of these, all the big theme of World War I was one thing. The big theme of World War II sadly became, genocide and insanity. And I think the big theme of World War III, when they write about it, is going to be Western civilization and rational people have fucking had it with despots and evil death cults. I really
mm.
think that's what it's going to be about. And they're all going to be gone. And you're going to be able to walk freely wearing a kippah and carrying a Torah from Tunisia to Istanbul. And all you're going to meet are nice people offer you tea along the way. That's what I
Yeah,
fully believe will be true in 10 years.
yeah,
A lot of people don't see it that way. They still see this as a regionally contained issue, but all the folks I know who are pretty smart, a lot of military folks, many of them agree. But a lot of people think, and I think the Iranian mullahs really screwed the pooch on this. Had it been, the irony is, had they just crept across the border, killed 6 more people, shot some more rockets, the whole world would be clamoring, as they always do, for the IDF to stop, and they might have listened. The rest of the world does not seem to understand.
mm.
You do not kill 1,200 people, take others hostage, and get to bitch to the UN about proportionality.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, they don't get it. The IDF is going to end this,
yeah,
or the Middle East is going up in a nuclear conflagration. Like,
yeah.
this is going to end. No
I
more.
agree.
Never again was a
I agree.
phrase in 1945, and unfortunately, it hasn't really been true until now. And my conviction is, after this, never again will be meant. This will
Yeah,
never
yeah,
happen
yeah,
again. That's
yeah.
my
But
conviction.
in this country, there's always been very kind of clear lines between um, different elements of Judaism
Yeah.
based
To answer
on
your question, I'm sorry. It has brought a lot more people together. A lot of
yeah,
folks who are not raised religious, who are raised reform. Like, I'm pretty happy wherever, right? I go to
yeah,
Bevis Marks when I'm in London. I'm happy
yeah,
at a reform shul. I'm happy at an
yeah,
Orthodox. Doesn't bother me. But there's a lot more closeness there. But the same left wing lunatics are doing the same crap. You got Noam Chomsky, who's got the world championship for being a self-hating Jew, is out there bitching about Israel.
yeah.
And
Well,
there's still plenty of leftists marching and complaining about Israel. So no, it has not made a unified front.
it's interesting because somebody was saying on some of the marches in Manchester and London, where are the Haredis? Where are they now? They're not on those marches. However, they are doing fantastic work, not necessarily overtly,
Yeah,
but they're out there doing other stuff. Um, and I think sometimes it's unfortunate that the kind of the middle of the road Jew points the finger. I mean, we've come to know that an awful lot more because of the way our daughter has married into that area.
right.
Um, and don't judge a book by its cover became very, very more obvious a statement to us than it ever had been,
Sure.
and it kind of makes you think.
Yeah.
But certainly, I think there's been the different Rabbonim from the different sects of Judaism have shown much more solidarity than they would have done, and it's the age-old truth. Hitler didn't ask what kind of Jew you were;
Exactly.
he didn't
At
care.
all. Didn't care in the
Um,
slightest.
and nothing has changed.
No.
So, I wouldn't like to think that we needed something like this to be closer together. But if that's a small benefit, then so be it.
I hope so. I mean, we'll wrap it up. I know you got to go.
Yeah,
I because of the work I do with the military, I started getting the raw video on October 7th in the evening and 8th and subsequent. And in my mind, the least I can do is not look away. Like the least I can do, and I take that, I love that from the Quakers, right, who are famous sort of, Christian pacifists. And as they said, their duty in wartime is they're not going to fight, but they are going to be doctors, and they'll be on the front lines, and they will be medics,
Yep.
and they will bear witness. It is
Yep.
their duty as humans, moral humans, to not look away. It's horrifying, nightmares, horrifying, but it has just stiffened my resolve. Like, these evil people need to die. They need to go. There is no, and what I find most horrifying and terrifying and disheartening is some leftist Jews in America, but just leftists of all stripes. Whenever someone starts to talk about the other side, it's all I can do to not literally attack them. There is no other side. There is no political conflict that justifies what was done on October 7th. That was not a political operation.
The only thing that makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable at times is that there are politicians in this country who've always been considered racist, right wing, protectionist, if you like.
Yep.
Nigel Farage is one.
Yep.
He was, obviously was one of Trump's great advocates.
I met Nigel, charming guy.
And when he speaks about Israel and Jews, you're listening to him and you're thinking, I love what you're saying.
Yeah.
But would I have ever voted for you outside of this subject? Probably not.
Right and wrong, right? And especially when it comes to the kind of political affiliation of the people in America that the media loves to call right-wing extremists.
Yeah, and there's
what they are is right and wrong.
There are a few more in that kind of camp that in the past I'd have thought, don't want to listen to this guy. But actually, you think, this is interesting. This is very interesting. So,
if you listen to him and listen to Douglas Murray, right? And you listen, I had a dinner in London when I was there recently with a bunch of conservative politicians. I think most of them Christian, very devout. And they fully understand. It was after October 7th happened, right? That this is an assault on Western civilization.
Yeah,
is what this is. It happens to be hatred of the Jew, but it comes and people are baffled. And I spent a lot of my time explaining this. I'm doing now on college campuses, and we try to do it in interviews. We try to do it in our writings. This is an assault on Western civilization. This is an assault on individual rights and responsibilities, which came from Mount Sinai. That's where it came from. And they hate the Jews because, I had this fight with a Palestinian friend of mine, and luckily we've known each other a long time. It was very heated, but at the end of it, I said, "Look, you just got to tell me why 850,000 Jews were thrown out of Arab countries from 48 to 67, right? Did the UN set up a permanent mission to help the displaced Jews who had all their crap stolen? No, they picked up their pants and got on with life.
Yeah.
Why are Palestinians, sadly in this context, the world's biggest losers who can't look after themselves? Get a life, make a living, stop bitching, stop hating. And until they fix their culture, this will never end. What was Golda Meir's line? That this will never end until the Arabs start loving their children more than they hate ours. She summed it up.
Yeah.
This has to end. It's crazy.
Of course it does. No, of course it does. Yeah. Good.
But anyway, it is a delight to talk to you. I'm sorry I took your time so long.
No, it's good.
Appreciate it.
I hope there's enough there for you to put something together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll still get something great out of it. We'll make sure that no one's calling you to ask how your grandson
and
is.
I love you must get a bigger Magen David.
Isn't this great? What I love about this is it's so ridiculous because it's Pounamu. So it's
what is it?
Mary Jade. It's Pounamu. So it's their traditional holy stone. And when I was
okay,
got a bunch of Pounamu, and when I asked, I'd love, could you guys do something special because they have all their traditional designs. And I said, well, could you do this? And I wasn't really thinking because there you go, nice big one, perfect. And I didn't really think, but when they did it for me, they made it and sent it, and when it arrived, Rebecca and the kids fell over laughing. They're like, "What are you, a Hollywood producer? That's ridiculous." But now, and so I usually wore it kind of like this. But now
Yeah.
wherever we go out in public, nope, loud and
Yeah,
proud.
that's good. That's great.
So we should thank you so much for taking the time today. We've learned a lot. To my devoted listeners, I will close as I always do. Remember to turn off the mainstream media who are lying to you and turn into messy times.